Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. The United States practices a double standard regarding nuclear weapons. Our American political culture tells us that when Iraq, Iran, North Korea, or other nations consider nuclear weapons, this indicates those nations' evil intent, but that our nuclear weapons are for self-defense, and our nuclear weapons protect freedom and democracy. Mainstream U.S. news media persistently repeat Bush's criticisms of Iran's interest in nuclear weapons. However, our media largely ignore Bush's own escalating plans to build more dangerous and more provocative nuclear weapons for the U.S. And while hyping purely hypothetical threats from other nations, the U.S. news media utterly failed to report that the U.S. has many weapons that we designed and built specifically to launch preemptive first strikes against other nations. The U.S.'s double standard threatens to scuttle the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which for decades has limited the spread of nuclear weapons. The NPT requires that non-nuclear weapons stay that way, but it also requires that the nations that do have nuclear weapons move quickly to eliminate their arsenals. The U.S. has always violated the NPT by failing to move quickly toward total nuclear disarmament, but Bush's unilateralism and his disregard for international law might be the last straw that destroys the Non-Proliferation Treaty and provokes other nations to build their own nukes. In case after case, the mainstream news media failed to inform or even downright disinform the American people. Fortunately, our television program here that you're starting to watch will continue our role of devoting a full hour to address the issues that are not being covered adequately on mainstream TV. And we'll address nuclear weapons from several different angles. And we have 3 guests who are well informed and who have a lot of rich insights, and our guests will help us do this. We have T.J. Johnson, Alice Zyla, and Bernie Meyer. T.J. is a member of the Olympia City Council, and he began studying nuclear weapons especially after a trip to Hiroshima, Japan, and he continued with a recent trip to New York for a conference of mayors for peace and activities that relate to the review of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Alice Zyla is a highly skilled local peace organizer, especially with the Olympia movement for justice and peace. Bernie Meyer has worked more than 35 years for peace, nonviolence, and social justice. He served 6 years on the National Fellowship of Reconciliation's Board of Directors. And both Bernie and Alice are very active with the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action next to the Trident Base in Kitsap County. So we have 3 guests with a variety of bits of knowledge and insights, and we'll have a great time here. I'm glad you're all here. For a lot of people, if they think of nuclear weapons at all, they think of them just abstractly rather than in a real physical or personal way. Bernie, you have some examples, some photographs that maybe can make it more real if we have a visual image. These were from Nagasaki?
Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Hiroshima. Okay.
It's from a child's point of view. They want to...
if you can just hold it...
hold it higher. Okay.
and
well, let's see. I want to show another one first.
Okay.
This is of the ground destruction that you will see. It is a totally eliminated set of buildings that were there, and a few people are around. So destruction was tremendous at the epicenter as well as for miles out. I remember going to a movie when I was about 8 years old in 1945, and there were no people in the pictures. There was just a road through all the destruction, and a cameraman going down the road quickly in the car, no people. And in these, you see a drawing of children's drawings of people in a river trying to escape, no clothes on, and also a burning person being pursued by somebody trying to help her. People in the situation. I since learned that the United States government censored the camera work that was conveyed to the people as a way of distancing the people of the United States and elsewhere from the human destruction that went on. Not only were they not allowed to see pictures like were taken by Yusuke of other destruction of people and what their sufferings were, but no mention of radiation was allowed at that point either. And in fact, these things were not revealed until between 1970 and 1980. So we were anesthetized from the beginning to a lot of the impacts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that began the process of accustoming us to this destruction.
Okay, thanks. TJ, you really connected with the concern about nuclear weapons when you visited Hiroshima, Japan in 2004, right? Tell us what happened.
Yeah, I had the opportunity following a visit to Olympia's sister city of Yashiro to go to Hiroshima last September. And like Bernie indicated, I had seen the pictures in the books, but really had not had a personal connection with this. But spending the day at Ground Zero and spending time walking through the many, many elements and components of the International Peace Park that's now at Ground Zero in Hiroshima had a profound experience on me. And as I went through that, I found myself getting both more and more distraught, but more and more enraged at the fact that not only had that bombing occurred, but that nuclear weapons continue to exist and to be a threat to communities throughout the world. And as a result of that, I felt that when I returned from Hiroshima, I absolutely had to do something and had to engage myself in this issue to do what I can to make a difference, to educate our community, and to take actions proactively here in Olympia to work towards nuclear disarmament and ensure that the kind of things that I saw in Hiroshima are never repeated in any other city anywhere ever again.
So you went to the Mayors for Peace event. Tell us about, and well, you got the city of Olympia the city council to do something positive about that. Tell us what that was.
Yeah, one of the things I learned at the Hiroshima Peace Museum was about the Mayors for Peace, and this is an organization that was started by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they're trying to engage civic leaders, mayors, and city councils across the planet in the cause of nuclear disarmament as part of something called the Vision 2020 campaign. And the U.S. Conference of Mayors have actually endorsed this and passed a unanimous resolution last year endorsing the Mayors for Peace. So I brought that idea back to the Olympia City Council and encouraged the City Council to join Mayors for Peace and to join the call for eliminating all nuclear weapons by the year 2020. The City Council passed a unanimous resolution on February 1st to do precisely that. And as a result of that, the Mayors for Peace organization invited Olympia as both a capital city and a port city to be a part of a delegation of mayors to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York City during the first part of May. And the City Council appointed me as the representative of Olympia to go and be a part of that delegation and to be involved in the international negotiations around the NPT and to push the cause of nuclear abolition from a city's perspective.
Okay, and we'll be talking some more about that as the program goes on. It's hard for Americans to deal with the reality of what you showed us and what you got to experience firsthand there, that we actually unilaterally bombed civilian populations twice. And people in this country don't realize how many times we've threatened other nations explicitly. And in the research I did actually about 20 years ago working on nuclear weapons issues, I found that we had at that time threatened at least 16 times since Nagasaki to use nuclear weapons against other countries. And that's more than 20 years ago when I came up with that. And I don't know how many more times there have been since then, but the Pentagon policy actually calls for the use of nuclear weapons as the final card to play in a conventional war. And that's what we've been threatening to do, is escalate a conventional crisis into a nuclear one. And I think people in this country don't realize how many times during the Cold War the U.S. was leading the escalation of the arms race. And it just went on and on and on. And a lot of the treaties that we had to minimize weapons were actually to negotiate away the things that we no longer wanted to compete about, like the number of missiles that would go up, because we were at that time starting to develop multiple warhead missiles, so that it wasn't the number of missiles going up, but it was the number of warheads coming down where the real action was. So we made it look like we were doing something positive by limiting missiles when we were actually escalating the number of warheads. And it just goes on and on. And the rest of the world knows this stuff, but for some reason the American people don't. And I think it's because the news media filter a lot of things out, and the government doesn't want us to know, as you said, with just the initial photographs, where the government keeps that from us. Bernie, you've studied a lot about nonviolence and people's subconscious attitudes toward death and toward hard realities. And I wonder if you can shed some light on some of the psychological or even spiritual dynamics of the nuclear realities.
Well, the horror of a nuclear explosion is tremendous. And people that have researched it point out that the people that experienced the explosion repress the fear and anxiety and come to a point of numbing themselves. Well, the people who perpetrate it, or who have the possibility of perpetrating it or of being victims also, do the same thing. We repress, as a defense mechanism, our feelings. So it's been called numbing the feelings and the mind. They're interconnected. to the realities involved. It happens in simple things, not simple things, but profound things in a simple family of domestic violence. An abused child often will repress the feelings. Same thing with the nuclear possibility. We have, as a country, repressed a lot of the possibilities so that we don't feel the danger that exists. And that's the main thing I think we want to convey here. There is real danger now. And the hope is we can wake up and let our feelings of the danger, our fear, our anxiety, move the country and move the world to nuclear disarmament.
When we were preparing for the program, you told me a short quotation from a book by Robert J. Lifton, The Genocidal Mentality, where he's quoting Thomas Allen defining the nuclear threshold. And this is just a quick quote, and then I want to have you share a longer one with us. But this one that has to do with, I think part of that anxiety is that we get into this area of there are no rules anymore. It's just the most bizarre form of anarchy. And the quotation says, "The nuclear threshold is a place where war by the rules ends. Beyond that threshold, there are no rules." And that's got to be upsetting and something that people don't want to have to confront.
Extremely upsetting. If there's no rules, there is a sense that we have the Nuremberg principles and the other laws, international laws, so-called governing the format of war, but there's no law governing nuclear weapons once you go past and start using them. So would you like me to read that quote right now?
Do that quote. It's long but powerful. I think it conveys a lot.
This is from his book on Robert J. Lifton, who has done a lot of research on these kinds of things, the genocidal mentality. And it's a jockeying between what it took Nazi doctors and other people to commit genocide or the Holocaust in Germany. And that's the same mental processes are used with the nuclear situation. It's a quote from that book, and nuclear weapons policies keep Americans and Russians, in fact all human beings, constantly at the threshold of genocide, with the willingness to cross that threshold being equally constantly asserted. Just as the Nazi genocidal intent prior to crossing the threshold was a good deal less clear than many people have believed, so is genocidal intent in nuclearism greater than meets the eye. A chilling lesson, though rarely drawn, of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is that the superpowers not only reached the brink, the absolute threshold, but that when there, were willing to take risks that could result in crossing the threshold into genocide, or provoking the adversary to do the crossing. The superpowers took these risks, even as they sought to avoid nuclear holocaust, because they were entrapped by policies and mindsets resulting from long-standing nuclearism. That entrapment at the nuclear threshold has been little recognized, possibly because it is so alarming.
Yeah, I think it's just a powerful thing about how that momentum, that juggernaut gets rolling, and people just don't stop. I mean, you look at how we got into this war with Iraq, where Bush had his mind made up, and nobody could stop it, and it just plowed on through, and this nuclear juggernaut rolls on in that same way.
We had a movie on this very subject a few years ago, the 13 Days of October, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the History Channel and other talk shows carried that movie scenario further, so they got into that subject.
Now, when about roughly 15 years ago, the Cold War ended, and people felt, oh good, now we can get ourselves out of this. But what's happened since the Cold War ended?
Yeah, most people felt good, except for the people who are in the nuclear weapons industry who felt that they were in trouble and in some consternation because their industry might start to go downhill after the end of the Cold War. So various think tanks worked on this problem of what do we do with all our nuclear weapons? How can we keep this industry going? And one of those primary think tanks that emerged was the Project for a New American Century, which envisioned the 21st century as the period of American dominance, and that dominance wasn't just confined to the Earth, but would even be confined or even extend to space. And so they started working on scenarios where we could actually use these nuclear weapons in new ways for new emerging threats, develop new nuclear weapons. But the threats seem to be everywhere to the people of this mindset. It wasn't just one superpower anymore, but it was threats around the world that might threaten our interests, basically. Our economic interests. And particularly our interest in global oil supplies.
And we should note that some of the people in that report from the Project for a New American Century are Dick Cheney and quite a large number of people who ended up Bush appointing into key positions in the administration.
Right, Paul Wolfowitz, John Bolton, Jeb Bush.
Richard Perle.
Yeah, all those people, they framed that policy and then got themselves jobs to implement it. As that spins out, one of the things that's resulted is that the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that I mentioned at the very beginning of the program comes up for reviews periodically, and you can tell us about the review that happened here in 2005.
Yeah, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was negotiated and signed 35 years ago, and the goal of the NPT was to halt the spread of nuclear weapons across the planet, but it also dealt with disarmament. And Article 6 of the NPT talks about the nuclear states moving deliberately towards disarmament. The United States was the lead on that treaty, and we signed it. And as you pointed out earlier, we've never abided by Article 6, the disarmament requirements. Every 5 years, the international community gathers to talk about the status of the treaty's implementation. And that conference just concluded in May of this year at the United Nations. And I wish I could say that great progress was made in the 7th Review Conference this year to move towards the implementation of the treaty, but in fact that was not the case. The conference was, in the words of Mohammed El-Baradei, who is the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, a complete failure. And it was a complete failure primarily because of the reluctance of the United States and the Bush administration to meaningfully engage with the international community on substantive issues. For example, there had been a period of about a year prior to the conference, and there were some preparatory sessions to design the agenda for the conference. And when the conference started on May 1st, despite a year of work, there was no agenda for the conference, primarily because of the United States' reluctance to address the disarmament issues. It took them a full 2.5 weeks into a month-long conference before they were able to agree on an agenda. So it's absolutely no surprise that they accomplished absolutely nothing in the remaining week and a half. And this is really unfortunate because it's really a step backwards. The last NPT review conference in the year 2000, significant progress was made, particularly on the Articles of Disarmament. And there were 13 what they called practical steps that were agreed to by the nuclear powers that would move us in the direction of disarmament. Things such as ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, a ban on production and transfer of fissile materials, pulling all of the nuclear weapons off of hair trigger alert, and agreeing to a no first strike policy. And the Bush administration has absolutely ignored all of those 13 steps. And as a result, we've had no progress in the last 5 years, and they did everything they could to sabotage the conference that just concluded in New York.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't recall exactly, but the number 188 sticks in my mind. Is that the number of nations signed on, or is it a little bit less than that? But it's virtually every nation on the planet.
Yeah.
Almost every nation has signed on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Yeah,
So
it's
when the United
188.
Yeah, it is 188. Okay, that was the number that stuck in my head. So when the United States stiffs that process, we're stiffing the entire world community, and the entire world community knows that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was quite evident in the conference in New York City, whereas most of the countries of the world sent presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers and their UN ambassadors to represent them at the conference. The United States was represented by the Junior Assistant Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, a guy named Stephen Rademacher. And Mr. Rademacher did not even bother to show up for the first half day's proceedings in which a lot of the tone was set for the conference. He did waltz in towards the end of the day and proceeded to point his fingers at the rest of the world, particularly North Korea and Iran, which are serious threats, and I don't mean to minimize those, but his focus was solely on the nuclear programs in North Korea and Iran and the risk of nuclear materials falling into the hands of terrorists. And then he had the audacity to stand up and say that the United States was in full compliance with the treaty and Article 6, the disarmament article, and that we should be congratulated and honored for our commitment to the treaty. And then he concluded his speech and he left the General Assembly forum and didn't bother to stay around and listen to anyone else from the international community talk about their concerns with the treaty. And that incident encapsulated, for me, the entire tone of how the United States was engaging or not engaging with the international community at the conference.
Yeah. So it goes back to that issue of hypocrisy that I mentioned in the introduction to the program, where we're telling everybody else what to do, but we're really just grossly out of compliance ourselves. I mean, it's been blatant, and we've watched this every few years, and here we're all upset about those countries, and we're not even, the Bush people aren't even putting the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which we've signed, they're not even putting it to we signed it before Bush came in, not even putting it up to the Senate for ratification. So.
And I'd like to point out that North Korea said that they were withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because the U.S. wasn't keeping to its commitments, and they said, if the U.S., the number one superpower in the world and nuclear power, is not honoring its commitments, we feel threatened by all the nuclear weapons that are pointed at us. We're pulling out and we're going to start working on our own nuclear weapon. Right. I don't think any of us would agree with that logic, but that's what they have since done. And so it's not only that this hypocrisy of our nuclear weapons are good, theirs are bad, but when other countries take sort of a logical step that they see as self-defense, it's held up as further proof of their intrinsic badness, and sort of this, self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Yeah. Well, because that's the deal in the NPT is the countries that don't have nukes don't get them, and the other half of the deal is the countries that do have nukes are obligated by law to get rid of them quickly. And here we are 35 years later. Now, you're concerned also about the militarization of space. And you mentioned that just briefly when we talked before a moment ago. Can you tell us some more about the U.S. government's ambition to militarize space? And this actually goes back before the Bush regime anyway.
Right, it does. So the Project for a New American Century defined that the U.S. needed to control and dominate space and own space as sort of the American frontier.
Kind of a manifest destiny, just like we conquered the West.
Exactly.
Now we're conquering space, and we own that too.
And Rumsfeld, coming out of the Project for a New American Century, developed a commission in 2001 that came to a similar conclusion, and that's why in 2002 the U.S. pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and started really developing, particularly the Air Force Space Command, these plans to put weapons in space. And it would be a very sophisticated satellite network that could monitor every part of Earth, basically, and convey that information back to the ground, and then eventually to actually put weapons in space. And so you're holding up the...
This came out a few years ago. This was from the U.S. Space Command.
Right.
This is their glossy booklet that they put out for people who would agree with them that this is a good idea.
And what I want to point out about that is TJ mentioned Vision 2020 as a project of the mayors for peace and the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not to be confused with the Vision for 2020 by the Space Command.
Yeah.
Two very radically different visions.
It's just the opposite.
One vision that sees total abolition of nuclear weapons by 2020. The other vision that sees that we might actually expand our nuclear capacity to space.
Yeah.
So one thing that they're working on right now is to put a nuclear reactor into space. And this is called the Prometheus project, and it's something that NASA is developing. So it's kind of a shock to learn that NASA is not any longer really, if it ever was, the agency that promotes kids' dreams about going to the moon one day. But for the last few years, they've had this dual-use policy that says that every NASA mission must also have a military purpose to it. Mm-hmm. And they haven't said what the military purpose for the Prometheus project is, but the Prometheus project would put a nuclear-powered rocket into space. And this is very connected with the Space Command's goals of having weapons in space that would be powered by nuclear energy. And some of those weapons range from one that's nicknamed rods of God that would fire titanium and uranium rods from space with the force at impact of a small nuclear weapon. Another one would use radio waves as weapons, and the expression was that could range from a tap on the shoulder to toast for anyone on Earth. So there's all these really outlandish and bizarre ideas right now that people in power and with a lot of money at their disposal are working on hard.
And what they're doing is, in this booklet, when I read it, and I read the whole thing, it's amazing how many times they talk about doing this to protect U.S. economic interests. And here, this big banner across the top on this one, need to hold upside down so I can read it. Dominating the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. national interests and investment, it says in the top line. And the idea is that we can use space weapons to zap any economic competitors and shoot down their satellites so they can't communicate. And so it's a pretty, an extremely aggressive thing. And they never mention this angle in the press. We've got a lot of material to cover, and I want to make sure that we are in touch with what the Bush regime is actually doing beyond this with some other things. We've talked about what they haven't done with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are some new nuclear weapons that they're pushing, and a new generation of nuclear weapons, including what's been referred to as bunker busters, the robust nuclear earth penetrator. And the idea is to be able to have a nuclear weapon that'll burrow down and get somebody's command and control center or wipe out their whatever weapons, biological or chemical weapons. And the Congress has been sort of mixed about this, sometimes supporting it, sometimes not in the last couple of years. And these bunker busters are just massively dangerous and provocative to the rest of the world. And so we want to talk, there's a lot more that can be said about these weapons, and you don't get much in the mainstream press, but a lot of good sources are available to find out. I want to talk a bit more with Bernie about, we talked some about the psychological aspects of people repressing the feelings and sort of being in denial. And there's also something called the superpower syndrome, and there's some other things that you've reflected on, including people's attitudes about death. And
well, what kind of mentality would use or even conceive of using these types of weapons? And there's many mental tricks people play on themselves to do this, dissociating themselves usually from the impact. They focus their minds and their feelings on the excitement of developing the cutting edge technology. A lot of things you were just mentioning, it's cutting edge. It's really exciting to send a new type of spaceship into the atmosphere powered by nuclear weapons instead of other kinds of fuel. And same with weaponry. It's exciting to develop new types of weaponry that can be refined without thinking of the consequences of the use of those things. And that's the type of thing. Robert J. Lifton led a conference a few years ago in 2000 in New York on the second nuclear age.
And you attended that?
I went to that conference because I've been involved with this issue for years. And the first nuclear age was to the end of the Cold War. And what happened during that period, the end of the Second World War, was, in some people's minds, due to our success with the atom bomb. And then the Cold War took place, and that was a real vying between USSR and the United States. And the image is that the United States won that war. We stood up and we overcame, and the nuclear weapons were the main tool. Mutual assured destruction, we overcame all the threats and won the war. So during that period, the United States gradually, the people of the United States and the scientists and the politicians just began to take these weapons and their systems for granted. And if you read Robert J. Lifton's book, Hiroshima, 50 Years of Denial, he'll show how that was intentionally developed, how people were intentionally misled and their psychology was manipulated so that this would take place. So now we're in the second nuclear age, and he uses the word embedded. This whole mentality is embedded in our psychology, in our point of view as accepted. And we have no touch with the consequences of this, the real threats that exist. You mentioned before 20 years ago that we had wanted to use nuclear weapons, or the government or military wanted to use them several times. I think you mentioned
16 times 16. Were documented by the early 80s.
And now we have a preemptive war mentality. We'll preempt, so it's gone way beyond that. And we've also had number of times there were almost nuclear accidents, which we haven't.
Quite a number of those that we don't even have time to talk about in the show.
So these threats are just ignored, and we don't have any feelings about it. We feel pretty comfortable. I don't, because I read about this, but so it's embedded, and it's become apocalyptic because this Osama bin Laden and his image of being a fundamentalist, wanting to cleanse the world of secularism, is his point of view, but we have the same point of view, and Lifton goes into the spirituality of this, the apocalyptic use of these weapons. So there's a lot to be said on this.
Yeah. Now, TJ, you have talked with the mayor of Hiroshima?
Yeah.
And you were there in 2004, and tell me where his thinking has been changed, about his attitude toward what needs to be done. Can you tell us about that just briefly?
Yeah, Mira Kiba of Hiroshima was sort of the head of our delegation at the NPT conference in May of this year. Mayor of Nagasaki was there as well. But I was particularly struck by one thing that Mira Kiba said, which was that the city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are no longer going to come to the international community and beg for the abolition of nuclear weapons and then sit on the sidelines while their pleas are continually ignored. They said the time has come to get serious about eliminating the scourge of nuclear weapons. And he ended by saying that the delegates to the NPT conference had a real opportunity to be the saviors of the human race. And he pleaded with them to not blow that opportunity. It was a very powerful moment.
And you've run across some public opinion polling in the U.S. and elsewhere that show that the public is getting serious about this, about nuclear disarmament.
Yes, absolutely, and it's further evidence at how out of step the U.S. policy is with the rest of the world. Large and strong majorities on every continent support the abolition of nuclear weapons, and you might think, well, but that's elsewhere, it's not the United States. But interestingly enough, several months ago, a poll came out that showed that 66% of the American public supports complete elimination of nuclear weapons, including the arsenal of the United States. So the international community and people across the planet and mayors and civic leaders across the planet are sort of over here, and standing on the other side, sort of all by themselves, is the Bush administration in complete opposition to the will of the governed.
Now, one of the things that's come out of your recent involvement with this is you came back home and pulled together some people to organize some activities locally so that local people can get connected and act. Tell us about that series. We'll cover some more of the details of it a bit later on, but give us just a little taste of what this series is.
Sure. It actually started after my return from Hiroshima, and I sort of plugged myself in as a city council member on some activities, but then as a community activist. I thought it was important for us to organize locally to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, which is coming up this August, but also to educate our community about what's going on now and the continued and escalating threat of nuclear weapons. And so we've planned a series of events for the first week of August that will do precisely that through a variety of forums, bring our community together to think about, reflect upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and organize and work towards a proactive community position towards abolishing all nuclear weapons.
And there's another exciting thing with the city of Olympia having the potential of becoming nuclear free. Can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, one of the things I learned at the NPT conference was that many cities across the globe and whole regions and nations across the globe have declared themselves nuclear-free zones, including a number of cities here in the United States. And I was implored by the mayor of Hiroshima, Mira Kiba, to pursue that here in Olympia, and that's precisely what I did. I came back and asked the city council if we could begin developing an ordinance that would declare a nuclear-free zone in the city of Olympia, and the city council on May 10th of this year agreed to that, and that ordinance development has been referred to the city's general government committee, on which I sit, and we will be talking about it this summer. There'll be some initial meeting on that in June, and then we are looking forward to a public hearing on July 19th to ask the community whether they want to declare a nuclear-free zone in the city of Olympia.
And what might the implications of that be? Is it clear what that would be, or is it?
Yeah, there's a number of things. And I largely am basing my work on a model ordinance that has been in place in the city of Tacoma Park, Maryland for 23 years and has withstood legal challenge on several occasions. It would make it illegal to transport, possess, use, test, and a whole range of other things, nuclear weapons within the city of Olympia, or components of nuclear weapons. And it would make it a criminal offense punishable by fines to do so. Second thing it would do, as I've proposed it, would require the city to develop a socially responsible investment policy so that the public money entrusted to the city is spent in ways that don't wind up enriching the coffers of corporations that are profiting from nuclear weapons. A third element would be to prohibit contracting with any businesses, corporations, or entities that are engaged in nuclear weapons. So we would say you're no longer welcome to profit off of our taxpayers' dollars. And then finally, there would be a public education component to this, wherein on an annual basis we would communicate the city's position and our reason for this position to our surrounding cities here in Thurston County, to our congressional delegation, both House and Senate, and to the President of the United States.
Okay, it's ambitious, but given the community spirit here, that seems something that could be attained if people want to organize and push for it.
And I think that's the key element, is that this won't happen because the city council or I want it to happen. It'll happen if enough members of the community say, this is a good idea and we want you to do this.
Yeah, so people could be in touch with the city council members. When we talked on the phone to prepare for the show, you suggested that people can contact the city council.
Right. Well, TJ mentioned 66% of Americans want to see an abolition of nuclear weapons, including the United States, and I think probably in Olympia that would be more like 80 or 90%, I would guess. So we don't want to be the silent majority on this issue. The City Council gets criticized quite a bit for taking stances on important national issues, be it the federal ban on gay marriage that was proposed, the Patriot Act, really important issues that affect us locally. I think they should take a stand on. But on this issue in particular, we really need to let them know that community support is behind making Olympia a nuclear-free zone. So one really important thing people can do is write letters to the editor of the Olympian and let the community know that our support is behind this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the grassroots, because if otherwise these national issues are handled only by people in Washington, D.C., and they have a pretty narrow spectrum of belief there. And here we have the grassroots and people are empowered. Bernie, I want to check with you about another way that people have been empowering themselves. A few years ago, was it 99? You
My trial?
Did some nonviolent civil disobedience at the Trident submarine base, where you took personal responsibility and you based your case on international law. And we're running short on time. I wonder if you could just summarize the point you made. You and 7 other people blocked traffic, and the jury from Kitsap County, this heavily Navy-based community, found you not guilty, and you were able to use international law.
That's right, because the charge we were faced with was disorderly conduct without authorization. And that without authorization clause enabled the judge, through a series of motions and dynamics, to open it up to treaties, because we have local treaties with Native Americans that have been through the courts. And so when that was opened up, the quotations of international law, which we weren't able to defend ourselves with, but that was in our minds in doing this action.
Because your state of mind was
the state of mind was valid, but not international law or necessity or a number of other defenses. But once that instruction to the jury went open, the jurors were taking notes from the signs quoting the international 1996 international courts outlawing of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I never get the name of the entity right, International Court of Justice or something like this, that actually declared that nuclear weapons are illegal.
That's right.
Back in '96, and that's widely ignored by the government here. But
most of the nuclear governments are ignoring that.
But what's powerful is that once the jury was allowed to consider international law, which by our Constitution, treaties become the supreme law of the land.
That opened the door, and they wanted us to be innocent, but they needed a legal way to do that. And that's what happens in these trials.
So that's the power of grassroots, and you did your own defense, which was really cool.
That's right. Yeah.
I read your materials back then, and it was very impressive.
Thank you.
Geez, there's so much to do. We've talked about a number of these things. Have we mentioned John Bolton by name? This guy that Bush is nominating to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and it's just appalling what his record has been on. Could somebody just summarize his role dealing with nuclear weapons?
Well, I think John Bolton has never met a treaty or a piece of international law that he has not wanted to destroy. And that certainly holds true for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. He's the Undersecretary of Arms Control now at the State Department. And the analogy was that that's the equivalent of putting the vampire in charge of the blood bank. He is not interested in any control of nuclear weapons or arms at all, for that matter. And so I think there's a real danger if he succeeds in becoming the UN ambassador. A lot of analysts, including even Republican analysts like Jude Wanniski, who's published on antiwar.com, feel that Bolton would do whatever he can to tank the NPT, to pull the U.S. out of it entirely if he were at that position at the UN.
And so the consequence would be if Bush gets his way and gets Bolton into the UN, is that's going to lead to more countries getting nuclear weapons.
Probably.
It's just so bizarre, it's beyond comprehension. Tell us some more about this Beyond Hiroshima event series coming up late July and early August. There's a website that has information that people can connect. I want to make sure that people know they can go to www.beyondhiroshima.org. And you've got a listing of some of the events. There are lots more than we have time to even talk about.
I have the list that's on that website, beyondhiroshima.org.
Okay.
And there are all sorts of cool events, starting even before the first week of August. On July 27th, this Peace Walk, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about, will be coming through town, and we'll have a welcoming potluck at Heritage Park for this interfaith Peace Walk that's crossing the state. And then all the events really kick off on August 3rd. There's a poster display at the side door gallery on Capitol of very powerful posters that show what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's children's activities, there's an outdoor concert, and there's some nationally recognized speakers coming in. Bruce Gagnon.
Yeah, he's powerful.
Yeah, he's the director of the Global Network Against Weapons in Space, and a really powerful speaker. He'll be here on August 3rd. And then another excellent speaker, David Krieger, who's with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, will be coming to speak the next day on August 4th. So that first week of August, or particularly the 3rd through the 8th, is just jam-packed with events every day that a whole group of people led by TJ have been organizing now for months. I think it's going to be really fantastic.
And all three of you are on the planning committee, plus a whole lot more really good local folks.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great group of people planning this. So, the website to get that listing is www.beyondhiroshima.org. Then people should probably check it several times for updates as the plans. Some of these, the last time I looked, were like the details are pending, but they got the idea out there, and so check in periodically. And we're taping this program long before those events start. So that's great. So tell us just briefly about the Peace Walk. We're running kind of tight on time, but just to...
Sure. Well, 2 Buddhist monks are leading an interfaith Peace Walk starting in Hanford, which is where the plutonium was enriched for the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And where, as a consequence, thousands of people have had really horrible health effects for the last 60 years.
People here in this state,
people on the east side of the state,
downwind or drinking the
they're
water.
called the downwinders, and a lot of them are suing right now because they have thyroid cancer and other problems. So we'll be meeting with them starting on July 16th, and then walking down across the southern part of the state by the Columbia and into Portland, and then up through Olympia on July 26th and 27th, up to Seattle, and over to Bangor Submarine Base in Bremerton. And Bangor is the location of over 1,900 nuclear warheads that are all many times greater than the one that was dropped on Hiroshima. And so the walk is called Hiroshima to Hope, and we'll be trying to communicate with people along the way and raise awareness about how weaponized and nuclearized Washington State is, and how we have a responsibility here to disarm.
Yeah, Hanford is one of the most contaminated places on the planet, and people don't realize that, and we've let that happen to our state. We want to invite people also to look for more information. About a year ago, I compiled a list of about 23 of the best sources of information on nuclear weapons. These are organizations, nonprofit organizations, and websites. And people can go to the website, the Olympia FOR website, and go to this particular page. It's www.olyfor.org, and there's a /links, and a / nukes. And it's got this listing, a paragraph about each one, so you know, depending on what you're looking for, if you're looking for technical stuff or congressional legislative stuff or religious-based or whatever, you can find what you need there. So I encourage people to go to that, www.oliefor.org/links/#nukes, and then also the www.beyondhiroshima.org, which is powerful. Let's see. Is there any other thing there? There's so many good things on the list. Is there one other thing that you wanted to highlight?
Well, one thing that'll be kind of unusual is a Butoh Dance on August 8th, and Butoh is a post-World War II Japanese dance form that's very emotional and deals a lot with war and humanity in the face of war. And Duran Crable, who's an Evergreen faculty who teaches Butoh Dance, will be leading this performance. And people are actually invited to participate. The classes will be going on in July. And people can look at the Beyond Hiroshima website for more information about that. But it's going to be around Heritage Park at dusk, and it'll be this very powerful presence of people coming out and performing this dance at Heritage Park on August 8th.
Yeah, great, thanks. We have just a bit of time for a short closing thought from each of you, and TJ.
Well, based on my experience at the NPT, it's obvious that the international community, primarily due to the Bush administration, will not solve the problem of eliminating nuclear weapons. And I believe it's up to us and our communities to do that. It's up to individual citizens, and it is up to city governments. You know, how can we in Olympia consider ourselves a sustainable community if we are engaging with our public dollars in the production of nuclear weapons, which are inherently unsustainable? So I think it's appropriate for local government to get involved, it's appropriate for citizens to get involved, and it's up to us to solve this problem.
Thanks. Alice, briefly?
Well, we mentioned Ground Zero a little bit, but I'd just like to point out that Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action is based in Bremerton and has been resisting the Trident submarine and the nuclear weapons that it houses for almost 30 years now, and Bernie's been very involved with it. I've been involved with it now for a couple years. And people are invited to participate in the activities also on August 8th, but on the morning. So there will be civil disobedience at the main gates of Bangor Submarine Base. And the website is gzcenter.org, gzcenter.org.
Thanks. Bernie, very briefly.
A brief quote from Gandhi when he was asked just before he was assassinated what he thought about nuclear weapons. And he said, "Nonviolence is the strongest force in the world. Unless humanity wakes up, the world may not exist or the humans may not exist as a species."
Wow. Well, I want to thank all of you folks. I want to thank the folks who have been watching. Regarding militarism, the political momentum is always toward maximizing power and secrecy, and this has especially been true since the Bush regime took power here in this country, and it's especially dangerous when nuclear weapons are involved. And so we really do need the ordinary people to stand up and do the right thing here. We want to thank all the folks who've been watching. For information about what we're discussing, you can visit the Beyond Hiroshima website at beyondhiroshima.org. For information about a variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolence, you can contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 491-9093. We're all one human family, and we all share this one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs just exactly what you have to offer.